Hi everyone, my name is Vani Krishnamurthy, and I'm the founder and director of Arts India US. You may have heard of us. It's a recent initiative that we've started to support Indian classical performing artists in the United States, emerging Indian classical performing artists. As part of this initiative, we do a number of different things, but one of those things is trying to foster some mentorship. We believe that this is really important because it often feels like emerging artists in these genres are starting from scratch. And the best way to make sure that that doesn't happen is to make sure that more seasoned artists transfer their knowledge to the next generation. So, as part of our mentorship program right now, we have a few very seasoned, very accomplished artists in the United States in Indian classical genres, willing to pass their knowledge down and be available to do so through our platform. So, as part of this, we have started a series called Conversations with an Artist. And our first mentor artist, as part of this conversation, will be Dr. Rohan Krishnamurthy, who will be mostly talking about his journey, but also touching on the art of creative synthesis. So I'll tell you a little bit more about that soon. But for now, I'd like to introduce my colleague, Megha Sanjay, who will give us a nice introduction of Dr. Rohan Krishnamurthy.
Hi, everyone. My name is Megha. I'm the Director of Strategic Projects at Arts India US, and we're really excited to present this interview with Dr. Rohan Krishnamurthy. He's an acclaimed percussionist, educator, and innovator in the Indian classical and cross-genre music sphere. He started his journey by learning the mridangam and has shared the stage with numerous distinguished artists in both the Carnatic and Western classical arts worlds. His latest work, the Alaya Project, is an Indo-jazz funk experiment with the esteemed Prashant Radhakrishnan on saxophone and Colin Hogan on the keyboard/accordion. Their debut album was highly praised, and the project was named the 2020 Ensemble in Residence at the Center for New Music in San Francisco. He also directs the Rohan Rhythm Percussion Studio and has taught around the world through forms such as masterclasses and academic courses. So as an innovator in the field, he patented a drumhead tuning system that can be applied to a variety of drums, including the mridangam, which is a really nice callback to how he got introduced to this world. In today's session, we're going to briefly explore his journey in the arts and that approach to innovation and inspiration, and gain some insights for emerging artists. So I'm going to just turn it back to Vani now.
Thank you, Megha. And this is an especially important time for Dr. Krishnamurthy and the Alaya Project. I believe it's the 50th show of your band, and you will be performing at SF Jazz soon in honor of that occasion. So welcome, Dr. Krishnamurthy.
Hey, good to see you, Vani and Megha. Thanks so much for having me today.
Great. Well, I'm just going to dive in. We have a lot of questions for you. We don't want to take a long time. But let's just start with how you got introduced to Carnatic percussion and what drew you to Mridangam in particular.
Yeah, it's sort of it's an unlikely story. I grew up in a small town in Michigan, Southwest Michigan called Kalamazoo. It's a small kind of university town, and now when I think back, like, for someone to become a professional, you know, Indian classical and crossover artist from Kalamazoo, Michigan, seems like a pretty unlikely thing, but that's just what happened. My whole family is very much into music, and especially, Carnatic music. I grew up with my parents' kind of record collection and tape collection. We used to listen to concerts, on all of our road trips and, at home. There was basically very, very little, Indian classical activity in Kalamazoo. It's a small town. Even today, it's not hasn't really changed that much probably in a few decades. But my parents, used to drive me to Chicago and Detroit, some of the, closest like larger cities, to attend live concerts and stuff like that. So there was a lot of exposure in that sense. there was of course like weekly bhajans and stuff like that that happened at our small, local temple. So there was, kind of exposure to devotional music and that the whole cultural context of it in that sense. But of course, we were also listening to the radio, when we were listening to, on TV when they actually played music on TV and, stuff like that. And you're exposed to all these different, genres. Um, and yeah, so there's this, right from the beginning, there's kind of an exposure to a lot of different styles of music. The Western Michigan University, which is a big state school in town, and also Kalamazoo College, had a lot of performances, different classical, Western classical, jazz, various global kind of performances on a regular basis. So there was also you know access, and exposure to those types of things, even though it was a small town. So there was actually a lot happening, and it was kind of like, I look back and it was kind of like that Goldilocks size, where it's like you're not overwhelmed with like, having too many venues and trying to figure out where to go on a Friday night kind of thing. But also, it had enough activities, enough of an arts, and cultural space where you had exposure to these different things.
And was there something particular about Mridangam that made you drawn to it, or?
Yeah, I mean, I think, in a very basic sense, it's the sound. I mean, there's something about the sound, that attracted me. My dad happened to have an instrument at home as well. There was, it was kind of a lifelong passion for his. He never got the chance to really learn. And he had an instrument at home. There happened to be a teacher in town when I was, 8 years old. He was a grad student in town. His name was Damodaran and Srinivasan. And he was in town and my dad started, lessons with him, as an adult. And that kind of fizzled out after a few months, but I was kind of exposed to that. And I remember asking my parents one day, I said, hey, can I learn the mridangam? And I don't think anyone thought too hard about that question. And they just, didn't, no one really thought about, what would happen later on. The rest is sort of history, I guess. But it just kind of, the stars aligned that way. And, happened to have a really great, teacher, who kind of set the foundation for me in about 2 or 3 months. He moved after that. He graduated. He left to like the Boston area, and he suggested, since there were no other teachers within like a 3-hour radius of Kalamazoo, he said, "Why don't we continue lessons over the speakerphone?" So like a kind of a pre-Skype, pre-FaceTime, pre-Zoom, kind of long distance education thing. All audio, right? There's no video. It's just you're just listening over a speaker. And but because he had taught me a lot of the foundational things, and because the art form has this whole vocal percussion or phonical language, drum language, he would recite things and I could play it, or I could recite things back to him. So it somehow all kind of worked out. Again, I look back at it and it's like it's such an unlikely kind of story. But as a kid, you're not thinking about any of it. You're just kind of doing stuff. And like I said, I still actually remember just sitting in the car and one day asking my parents, "Hey, could I start learning the rhythm?" I'm like, it's not like I thought any of it through. It was just, it was just, I was interested, and then, kind of one thing leads to another.
Oh, that's helpful. I think most artists would agree that it's probably not something that can be put into words in terms of what leads you to want to do something like that. And then Goldilocks sounds right. It seems like just situationally a lot of things aligned as well. So.
Yeah, and I mean, I guess the other thing, is like my parents and my family is very much interested in Carnatic music. My mom was a trained Carnatic singer, and she would sing bhajans and all that stuff. So I had the environment at home, but it's not like I had professional musicians. I'm actually the only professional musician in my family. So there wasn't like a pressure, like there was no one pressuring me to do any of it, right? It was just like the environment was kind of there. And then I kind of started pursuing, and then of course there are various currents that kind of take you down different paths. But it was never like my parents never forced me to do it or something. In a lot of places now, as an educator myself, based here in the Bay Area, for example, like there's a huge diasporic population, and for a lot of students, it's a sort of an assumption that you'll learn the mridangam or bharatanatyam or singing or something. Like it's just, it goes as part of like the community, as part of the cultural experience, which in some ways is wonderful, but in other ways it's like the current is already starting at that age, like before you even know about any of it. You're just like expected to do these things. So I didn't have that for, for better or for worse, and I didn't have that community either. So I had to kind of build a lot of those things and those experiences. And again, in a pre, what should I say, like a pre Zoom, pre FaceTime kind of era where you're still actually listening to tapes and CDs and records and stuff like that. And I look back and I actually, while it was challenging in many ways, like there were also a lot of benefits to having those kind of resources versus like a YouTube or streaming where sometimes your experience is very fragmented, very like partial. You don't listen to a whole
Right.
concert, for example. You just listen like 5 minutes of this, 3 minutes of that, and you don't get a sense of like the full context sometimes.
Sure, sure. That's a problem in many genres. So what did, you are where you are right now, and I think for a lot of people that were interested in attending today, the idea of what did your practice look like in high school or, in your teenage years? You know, can you remember back to how often you practiced, what kind of went into each practice session? And even things like, did someone make you practice or was it self-motivated?
Yeah, so practice like is always like it's always been a big part of my life. Even today, I got in a pretty solid practice sessions, and I'm like and like in a good mood to, to keep going and creating. So practice is kind of like the foundation of I think what we do. Um, yeah, and of course, like I should also mention, so I had this about like 1 year of online, not online, but like speakerphone training, long distance education with Damodar Srinivasan. Then after that, I met Sri Guru Dora, who was one of the legends, in the field. He was coming on a concert tour in Michigan, and again, the stars just kind of aligned. None of this was like I was a highly strategically planned or and you can only plan some of these things out. Life, transitions like to some extent, right? But I just met him and something, and before the concert, something just kind of clicked. And he said, "Hey, do you want to sit with me on stage for this concert?" I think I was 9 years old or something, and I'd never done that before. And I said, "Okay, whatever." And and it was like one of these epic like 5 hour Carnatic concerts, right? Like this at Michigan State University where my uncle was teaching, and I sat the whole time. So I think he was kind of like impressed. He was like, "Well, this like 9 year old is sitting here for like 5 hours." So he just told my parents, I think afterwards, he said, "Hey, next time you're in Chennai, where he lives, he's like, hey, just come over to my place and I'm happy to start teaching him." He didn't hear me play, he didn't know anything about me, but it was just like this. He saw a certain kind of maybe passion or dedication, this just by sitting there for the through the concert. And yeah, I mean that was so that was another sort of pivotal turning point. The next summer when I was 10, I went to Chennai and just to take sort of lessons with him in person. Um, and that has been continuing basically since I was 10 years old. And then I started performing shortly thereafter in the US regionally, then throughout the US, Canada. I started performing in Chennai, I think since I was like 11. I've been going there pretty much every year. In fact, actually next month I'll be there for the Chennai season concerts as well. So and then by high school, you're talking about high school. Yeah, I started learning piano and drum set. I would say semi seriously. I mean, I wasn't part of any like private tutoring or so anything like that. But I took some classes. I was kind of experimenting with things. I classical musician, so
Go
yeah,
ahead.
so we talk about high school. It was a really pivotal time musically because at that point I was already performing concerts fairly regularly, regionally, in the Midwest, and sometimes the East Coast, sometimes the West Coast, if you showed in Canada. I was playing in India once a year during the season. So I was pretty, actively performing, as much as you could, being in the diaspora, in Kalamazoo, Michigan, of all places. Um, and I was also starting to learn semi seriously, piano and drum set. And I was starting to have, make friends with other pre-professional musicians.
And just
That
so, and I don't mean to interrupt, but just because I'm interested in this topic, like, and was all of that self-motivated? Or did any of your gurus say, hey, you may want to also take up this, or your parents sort of tell you, hey, if you're going to do all this, you need to practice this much, you know?
Not yet. I mean, not really. It's the performances, I mean, it goes without saying, but I guess, I might as well, say it to be clear. As a high schooler or even beyond, like going for performances around the country and let alone India and Canada and stuff requires a lot of family support, right? I mean, I was not, driving a car around the country as a teenager doing shows or going, to Chennai and performing. So there was a lot of family, support to make that happen. And the way a lot of things happen in the scene in any sort of arts entertainment business, like you do a show and you do a really good job, and then the word kind of spreads and someone recommends you for something else and something else, and it kind of naturally blossoms like that over a period of time. So it kind of happened like that. Again, I'm just kind of giving you an overview here. The none of this is like a straight line linear simple process, right? Like it's the trajectory of any artist or business or entrepreneur is all over the place. Like I'm giving you like a very neat narrative right now, but in fact, this narrative is something that I've had to think about a lot, even to make sort of sense of it. As a high schooler, as a college student, like actually not really, you're not thinking too much about any of it. You're just kind of doing it and experiencing it, and experiencing the challenges and the opportunities, but not really knowing like why you're doing what you're doing and where it's going to go. That's kind of a later post facto thing, I guess. So I was making friends with other pre-professional artists who, not again specifically because I was trying to do it in a strategic way or something, but they just happened to be in my high school or whatever, and we were started talking, and then my mind was really starting to open up that, wow, okay, like, so sure, there's this Carnatic thing, then there's this whatever pop stuff you're listening to on the radio and TV and whatever, but there's also like there's all this other space. There's this whole like kind of overlap space, in the whatever the contemporary, jazz world, or there's all these like, or even the Beatles and stuff like that. I mean, I didn't even know who the Beatles were until whatever later in high school, and I was like, whoa, like I had no idea that so much of their sound was based on Pandit Ravi Shankar and like their interactions with Hindustani musicians and stuff. And then I was starting to already see a lot of connections between these different genres. Not like I didn't have any one like band or artist was like, oh, like that's like the guiding path for me. It was more of like, well, there's actually seems to be a lot of like uncharted territory, where there's a lot of connections that can be made. And so that was sort of becoming a major interest of mine. Then I went to college and stuff, and then actually did a music major, and was very more consciously forming these connections in new ways. But
That's
yeah,
well, that's a great segue for us because we want to focus some of this discussion on, how you approach these cross-disciplinary collaborations. So clearly you have some background in other disciplines from the beginning. But what actually, what motivates you to do these cross-disciplinary collaborations? And then what actually happens? I think sometimes people are in the dark about how do they even get together? What happens first? Is there a leader? And how does it all, come together?
right. So there's a few things here. You had asked about my practice. So long story short, the practice was pretty much daily. It was pretty much self-driven. Not in many ways, it's not. I never practiced with like looking at the clock. It was very much practice like to perfect whatever it is I was trying to do. And I had a certain, even I remember when I was even just starting, like I just couldn't like stop until I learned and mastered whatever it is like my teacher taught me. And he never like even my first teacher never specifically, he was never like you have to play what I taught you the last time perfectly. And like, he was not like terribly strict or anything that way, but it was some kind of like I had some my own sort of like self-check kind of like thing where it's like, okay, like I learned this, I need to practice it, master it, and memorize it. I had this idea that like I don't want to forget what I've learned. I remember even in an early age there was something about like what's the point in doing all this if I forget it? So like I would keep like kind of rehashing, reviewing, reciting things. Like even I'd be watching TV and practicing on my knees and reciting stuff, like just like there was some idea like I don't want to forget it. Why is that? These are oral traditions, right? I mean, we Indian classical music, most kinds of music around the world are not based on notation, right? So um, my mom, I think she used to write all these things out in her own kind of notation. She, patiently sat there through hours and hours and hours, months and months of work, lessons, and would write these things out. But I don't remember using that as much until later on. As a kid, I was learning it by ear and just kind of going through it and wrote. So that was part of the practice. And then I think the idea was like, I was also practicing mostly by myself. There was no community really per se. It wasn't like there was another mridangam player or a singer or a dancer to practice with. I was just kind of practicing at home by myself with my mom as a singer. I used to practice with her a lot. I used to practice with recordings a lot. I used to play tapes and CDs and stuff like that a lot and just practice along with. And I learned a lot and I listened a lot to like my teacher, my guru that his recordings, his teacher's recordings. Like, so I started like getting really into like kind of the history of it. Again, none of this was like conscious, but it was just like, whoa, okay. Like we suddenly have recordings of like not just my teacher, but his teacher. Like, so what was he doing? Like, how does my teacher's style like kind of relate to the way his teacher was playing? Like, so I started getting into those kinds of things. Um,
That's very rare. I mean, I to hear, right? And it's interesting that you're saying, well, you're often practicing alone, but as an artist, you can imagine that at the end of the day, it is sort of an introverted endeavor to get it exactly right. You have to do it alone, you know.
yeah. And I
Uh,
was, getting training from like Sri Guru Adore, like what, maybe 1 or 2 months a year, right? So the rest of the time, like you got to practice by yourself, and you have to practice with whatever recordings you made and with, and then you're playing concerts or whatever. But very much like a lot of what we do as, artists is you do practice, so then you can then play, with other people and improvise on stage and stuff like that, right? Like there's this famous like Pandit Ravi Shankar quote where after some concert, like someone comes up to him and says like, "How long did you rehearse like for this performance?" And he's like either I've didn't rehearse at all or I've been rehearsing my whole life for it, right? Like just depends on how you think about it. So I kind of got into that, and because like I wasn't playing every week or something. Concerts were maybe once a month on average, and then suddenly you'd have like 10 shows in December in Chennai. Like all of a sudden, like you're going from Kalamazoo, Michigan to Chennai, like this back to the homeland in a completely different context. So there was very much this idea like I have to keep up my chops. Like I can't get rusty because if you just suddenly, I mean, I'm also in school, I'm also doing all these other things, like you have friends, like so on top of all that's like you suddenly sit on stage with, whatever artist X, like you have to really be ready to play. And this is an improvisational art form. Like there's no 1 week of rehearsals before the show. Like you just show up and you gotta play. You have to be ready. And the higher and higher you get, like even the more prepared you have to be for whatever comes. So that was kind of happening for a long time. Even now, although the community is larger and although I have a lot of collaborators, like there is something very, I consider my like practice time as like a ritual. It's like a precious like meditation or ritual time. And whatever that is, like I don't put a number on it. Like I never put a number like I have to practice half an hour, 1 hour, whatever. It's like, and even with my students, I never put a number. It's just like whatever you do, like do it with 100% focus and intention. 10 minutes of focus practice is better than like an hour of like distracted practice, right? So
that's
and through
that's great
college, for
advice.
everything, like there's so many other things happening, and even now even more thing as a professional musician, like I'm like busier doing like non-practice related things, on a daily basis. But you have to carve out that time, and whatever that time is, like give it your all.
Yeah,
um
no, that's great advice for emerging artists, I believe, because I think it can, especially nowadays, you're saying that you didn't really have that community back then or that feeling that everyone was doing this and this was expected of them. But at the end of the day, they need to have that, sort of self-motivation to
yeah.
practice and think of it as a meditative effort.
And I guess the other like driving force, like, yeah, the question is like, why was I doing any of this, right? Like, I mean, because a lot of students, I mean, I assume part of your question is like a lot of students don't like to practice, or their parents have divorced them or whatever it is. So that was never quite the case for me. So like, why was that? I mean, sure. I mean, there was some kind of like, you know, obviously some very deep connection to the music, but it was also at a very basic level, it was kind of the sound and the artistry that was driving me, right? So when I'm listening, when I would watch my teacher play or listen to recordings of him or his teacher or these legends, it was kind of this like, it was like, whoa, like, so this is what you can do like with the instrument. Like you're no longer like, you're always like looking like 10 steps ahead of where you are. Right. So it's like, wow, okay, never mind. Like I thought I knew something, and then you listen to this and it's like, wow, like never mind. There's a lot of steps to go.
Yeah.
Um, so that I think was like a constant kind of drive, like, well, like there's a lot more to explore and to learn. And I remember I had some very like incredible sessions with my teacher where I would play things like that his teacher, I heard recordings of his teacher, and I played to him, as kind of as a kid, not, not knowing all the, seniority, things happening. And he'd be like, wow, okay, you've been you've been studying like my teacher's playing. And he would then kind of like, but I never seen him. These are audio recordings, right? So he'd be like, oh, this is really cool, but this is actually how he played. These are like the techniques he'd use to play. Like I was just trying to do it by sound. He's like, no, actually, try this, try that. But so there are all these like kind of cool, we talk about like tradition, right? Like this is, I think, what it is. It passes down from generation to generation, and it connects so many, different generations.
That's great. I wanted to go back to that question about collaborating and just have you, I guess, in some ways, just unearth this black box of collaboration. What happens when you decide to collaborate with artists?
Yeah. So I think one of the biggest drivers for me in terms of collaboration was my, you know, sort of medium of expression, which is rhythm. And rhythm is like, it's like one of the only universals in music. Like we talk about like music as a universal language, but in reality, like it's not, right? Like I mean, language itself is a huge barrier. Uh, there are different instruments all over the world. There are different tuning systems. Like nothing is actually universal except rhythm. Like all music has rhythm. And it's all based on rhythm. All traditions around the world have drums. Like that's a universal. So even though I was learning Carnatic music, getting deep into it, listening to like these, legends, going to India, traveling around the diaspora, playing, um, I was also again listening to the other styles of music, listening to the drum set as an instrument that always attracted me because it was like an instrument that's like kind of the foundation of pretty much all of American pop music, like not just pop, but like jazz and funk and country, everything like is like the foundation of that is the drum set. So I was like, okay, this is interesting. Like so how is it? So what is it about like the rhythm that's actually connecting all of these different genres? So that was, because I'm not doing something that's specifically like lyrical, like not language based. There was always this like, okay, well, what's the connection? And how is it that two drummers from like different parts of the world can just come together and start like playing? And I'm talking about even like a jugalbandi, like a mridangam and a tabla player can come together on stage and play for like 30 minutes without saying anything in advance, without preparing anything. Like so there was something universal about this language of rhythm, or for that matter with a dancer or something like that. There's the rhythm is what's connecting. Um so that was, I think, a main, sort of driving force for my kind of collaborations. But again, most of my collaborations are, I guess they happen organically, right? Like it's never like I woke up one day and said, "Hey, I need like an Indo jazz funk band." Like that was never an idea, right? It's like it was more like I've known like Prashant, for example, our sax player, we've been playing together for I think 25 years. Like we literally grew up together playing like since middle school. Although he was in Phoenix, so like but we'd play these concerts together and our teachers played together and all this stuff. And he is also, an incredible jazz player. So we've been sort of exploring ideas for like literally since we were in middle school. And then, certain things happened that allowed us to like, then I was like, wait a second, like we have something really unique here. Like let's try to develop it into like, a concert experience kind of thing. Um, so I think the organic development is really important. And with any kind of collaboration, like the more you know about the other traditions you're dealing with, the better, right? Otherwise, it's just gonna be kind of like a whatever hodgepodge kind of thing where everyone's like equally confused about what's going on. And I mean, that's cool in its own way, I guess. But the more you know and study like the art form and the people who are doing it, like that, I think is really, really important. Otherwise, it could be like, people just speaking different languages at each other and not actually understanding each other. Um,
That's an interesting point. Do you think that allows you to have greater or less touch with kind of what the audience is capable of enjoying, right?
Right.
You know, so how much you consider what sounds good to a layperson's ear when you're collaborating versus what is like enjoyable to you.
Yeah. I mean, I guess they're two separate issues. So, like, collaborating is like, I think of it, I use like the language analogy a lot because music is like a very abstract thing. But it's like you can technically talk to anyone, right? Like you could talk to anyone you interact with, and if they're speaking a different language, maybe you learn their language, they learn their language to some extent. You can start, interacting and conversing with each other. Um, Now, whether that conversation is interesting to other people, like that's a separate thing, right? So, like, do other people want to hear that conversation? Like, do you have something interesting to say that other people want to hear? That's a separate sort of thing that you have to kind of work on. So, um, and also like in general, like I don't like generalities, right? Like you can't really generalize about like what an audience is gonna like and why they're gonna like it and stuff. Like audiences are diverse, they're different people, every show is different, and you can never really understand or guess what's going on through people's minds, right? Like what's going to resonate, what's not. A lot of times in performances, people are might be responding to just the way the visuals of it, like the way that the artists look and interact with each other. It may have nothing to do with the sound, but it's like it's the experience or the venue. Like, we're playing in, a wonderful venue on Sunday at SF Jazz. So that is like a big experience for a lot of people. Like, we are probably one of the few probably Carnatic groups and Carnatic inspired groups to ever play, in a place like SF Jazz. So for the South Asian community, like it's kind of like a milestone experience, to be there and to support, a Bay Area based, group as well, an Oakland based group, in that venue. So there's a lot of things that can resonate with people. Also, like, I mean, there's something to be said about testing it out. Like if we're nearing our 50th show. We're not quite there, but we're almost there. So we're sort of celebrating that goal probably in our next season of touring. And so we've been doing this for a long time. Like there are very few acts that I can think of that I've played this much, right? In so many venues for so many different people across the country. Most of our shows have been in the Bay so far. We had an East Coast debut at Joe's Pub in New York City in the spring, and the Strathmore in DC. We're in the South in Dallas actually in January, but we have played a lot of venues. So we didn't start playing at SF Jazz, right? So we started playing just about everywhere. Our first show was actually a 50th tribute concert for the Sgt. Pepper's album, the Beatles album. And we were called to play that in Berkeley and to like reimagine like one of the pieces in this Sgt. Pepper's album, being for the benefit of Mr. Kite, which is like this really quirky tune that we still actually play in our sets today. That's like the first piece that brought the three of us together as the like Alea project, right? So, and we've played in all sorts of community spaces. We've done, Bay Area Diwali library series. We played, of course, so we didn't just play, in one kind of venue, and so we were kind of like testing this with a lot of different audiences and different capacities, and that helped us kind of refine what we're going for. But again, it was not it was something that organically developed over a very long period of time. Like and I'm so comfortable and I trust like the musicianship and the artistry of Prashant and Colin Hogan, who's on piano and accordion, and Rupa Mahadevan is a wonderful singer, often sings with us, um, and we've had other guest artists as well. But it's like you're it's like having a conversation with people you've known for a really long time, right? And every time you come back, it's like the conversation can keep going and going and going in different directions. Sometimes they're talking about old stuff, sometimes talking about new stuff, but it's like the conversation is going to be interesting, right? And
That's
have a certain flow. You're never going to stall. There's never going to be crickets. It's like it's going to keep moving. And
that's a great metaphor. It's just like a language, but you're actually just having a conversation
yeah,
um,
you're having a
through
conversation
this
with people
language.
you really like and trust, and they're always willing to learn from. So
Right.
I mean, again, I mean, I think again one of the most important things about like about being an artist or being anything sort of like self-driven is like you have to always want to learn, right? Like you have to always be a student, always be a lifelong learner. These are sort of cliches now, but like it's a cliche for a reason. Like I mean, the minute you think you have mastered something or you're no longer learning and have to preach to the rest of the world, like that's kind of the end of it, right? Like that's sort of the end of your process. So in your journey. So
So
constantly
perhaps
learning.
the takeaway is sort of there's got to be this openness that's always there to learning, but then also it seems like when you're talking about these collaborations starting very organically, it's sort of, for these emerging artists who might be thinking about collaborating, finding that chemistry, and then things would organically developed with another artist if that were the
Yeah.
case.
And collaborations also, I think they always keep you at the level of a student, right? Like you're always learning from the other art forms, the other, people who are proficient in their own way, that have their own lived experiences. So you have to be open to learn from other people as when you're collaborating. Again, I think also like the point is you have to kind of give collabs, like any kind of collaboration, like time to develop. Like it's great to think that all of a sudden like you're gonna meet some other artist and like you're just gonna like have this incredible like chemistry and create this like show that's gonna tour, for 50 shows. Yeah, maybe. But a lot of times like you kind of start with some ideas. There's a lot of random jam sessions, there's a lot of random like exploring. And then you're like, okay, this kind of works out. Or the other way around, like you have like an opportunity and then you try to bring some people together, but some of it works, some of it doesn't. So there's a lot of workshopping, right, that happens, and you have to give it time, let it develop. And yeah, you can't really force it. Now, I mean, nowadays you see it, of course, a lot of things are just like collabs just for collab's sake. Like I have to do a collab to like be relevant or whatever. And that kind of stuff, it won't stick, right? I mean, it might be an interesting, maybe it gets a few likes, but it's like, would you want to actually listen to that? Would you actually pay to experience that, in a live setting? Like that's a different thing. Like
Well, that's an
you can't
interesting
force
point.
the chemistry.
Yeah, it might not have the longevity. It doesn't have that kind
Yeah.
of spirit, the same spirit behind it that, you're
Right.
talking about.
And
Um,
yeah, especially I guess with social media, like again, I think of it as there's two different experiences, right? Like a 50-second collab on whatever Instagram or TikTok is one thing versus like a 90-minute live creative experience,
yeah.
right? They're two separate things. I'm not saying that you can't do both, but many times it's like you have things that are one thing or the other, right? It's like, and the 50-second collab is cool for 50 seconds. You can't actually, and if you wanted to, like, there's not enough content there to create a live show, right, for an hour or whatever, or is it 90 minutes? And the other way around, like the 90-minute thing actually may not distill down to 50 seconds. Like it just may not translate. You have to experience that in its own way. So we're now living in this like kind of like dichotomous like world where it's like you have the live thing, you have like this social media digital thing, stuff that connects it. So like we have to really figure out like what you're doing, why you're doing it. But I think the authenticity and the chemistry and stuff like that comes through in any medium. Like it's clear when it's there, when it's organic, when it's like marinated versus like when it's really raw and forced and superficial. That I think any audience like member can tell that out.
No, that's interesting. That's an interesting point. Yeah, it is dichotomous, but at the same point, the authenticity can be in both places, but
Yeah,
it's clear from the
right.
beginning. So that actually brings us to an interesting point of how do you, I mean, this can be a controversial question, I feel like, in this community, but how do you balance maintaining the integrity of these Indian classical forms of music while sort of still exploring that collaborative aspect? And, or, is that even something that you consider?
Yeah, I mean, I don't view collaboration and tradition as like opposites in any way, right? I mean, every Carnatic music concert, for example, is a collaboration. You're collaborating a singer, a violinist, a mridangam player, a ganjiro player, whatever, guttam player. You're collaborating. Like if you don't view it as that, it's basically like it's kind of a dead art form, right? If you're just going and running through the motions, like okay, that's cool, but like it's not a living tradition at that point. It's just like you're just rehashing what was already been done. So everyone has to come in with that openness, with that idea like we're a team, we're an ensemble, we're a band, we're collaborating, we're in the moment, we're spontaneous, we're responding off of each other, we respect each other as artists, as people. All of these things have to be there. Whether it's a tried and true format, like a traditional format that's been around for a century or more, or if it's something completely new where you're trying to figure out basic structures and forms to even, interact with each other. So I think the openness has to be there, regardless of what setting you're in. It more comes down to like how many conventions do you have with the thing that you're doing? How many things can you fall back on versus like how much of it are you truly creating, new and on the spot. Um, I was actually just a part of a tour called Unfretted, which was like a trio with two of my friends. Shruti Sarthi is a violinist based here in the Bay in India, and Vishal Sabhuram was a Chitrabina player, also from Austin, also based in India. And that was very much exploring like Carnatic music, but like in a contemporary way, like looking at different textures, interplay between instruments, different repertoire, just kind of like rethinking what the Carnatic experience could be. And we were typically playing in for very diverse audiences, many who've never heard Carnatic music before in totally new spaces. So they're, of course, listening to the music and experiencing it in a totally different way from like a straight ahead Carnatic audience, right? Um, and so there's a lot of room for exploration even within the established, genres, right? I mean, it
Yeah,
just
no,
comes down
that
to what you're interested in doing and like how, open and how like how much of that you want to explore, I guess.
right. No, that's an interesting answer. So you're an educator. Um, how much do you sort of talk about collaboration in kind of training your artists versus sort of, educating them more in traditional formats? Or do you believe that the collaboration aspect is, like you said, organic and kind of comes over time individually or on their own?
Yeah, I mean, I actually have this kind of conversation usually with students at a pretty early stage. And they, kind of like prefacing that you may not have the answers to these questions, but it's just something to think about, right? There are some students who are come to me who are like, my goal is to play a like 3 hour Carnatic concert the way, you've done it, the way your teacher's done it, the way his teacher's done it. And that's kind of a goal. Okay, cool. Like that's like sort of one path and nothing else. Like I just want to do that. That's my goal. And I may or may not be a professional musician, whatever, but like that's what I want to do. So that's one path. There's a certain like syllabus for that, right? We were all actually basically trained with that syllabus in mind. Like I wasn't trained. There was no syllabus to be a cross genre artist. Like you had to kind of do that on your own, figure it out. We're still writing the rules for this, for this lifestyle. But so that's one track. But a lot of students, here in the diaspora, and I have like, of course, uh, Indian, non-Indian students, first gen, second gen. We're dealing with third gen students as well now, Indian Americans, for example. So for many students, most students, I would say, actually do not have the standard traditional exposure to Indian classical art forms, say the way people maybe, a generation or two in the past had, because back then you just were exposed to less. So if you were exposed to Carnatic music or Bharatanatyam or whatever, like you were kind of exposed in a few, one of a select few ways, and that's all you kind of did. Um, but nowadays, most people are exposed to like too many things. Like on you have YouTube, you have like everything, at your fingertips. So or at least whatever's digitally available. So there's that. A lot of people don't even know what like the Carnatic tradition is or the Indian classical. Like there's a starting point there. Like what is it? What is it today? Are you interested in that? Because a lot of your friends might be playing the piano or might be playing the guitar or might be doing something else. Like, do you want to play with them? Like, is that of interest to you? So, I do talk about these things. Again, a lot of students may or may not, even parents may not necessarily have answers to these, but they're immediately thinking, well, like, actually, these art forms, like a lot of times we think of it as it's like frozen in time, right? Oh, like Bharatanatyam is this, like the mridangam is this, the tabla is this, like the oboe is this. Like you think it's some like thing frozen in time, but I mean it can be if you want it to be, but it's also a living, breathing tradition that's going developing in so many different ways. So I think it's important for students to kind of think about that. I mean, whatever you do, like if you want to play your instrument, you got to learn the techniques, you got to learn some repertoire. But if you're really interested in collaborating with other people for, those are the people you're growing up with, those are the sounds you're interested in. I had a student actually, a very, very, pretty long time student. A student's been learning from me for, I think, for almost 4+ years here in the Bay, very seriously every week for 4+ years. And he very specifically told me, like, he's like a middle school student. He specifically told me, he's like, I love the mridangam. I love Carnatic percussion. I don't really like Carnatic music, meaning like he's not really into like the singing or like the kuthi. He's like, I really actually want to just play with like my marching band. He also plays, he's a drum set student of mine, so he's like, I want to play in my marching band. I want to maybe play with like a friend of mine who plays the piano. I'm just not really interested in playing like a standard Carnatic concert. I was like, yeah, that's fair. I mean, that's where we are, in 2024. That's where we are in the diaspora. And like, you don't, just because you learn this instrument, you shouldn't feel like you have to go down this one path. Now, that doesn't mean you shouldn't learn the instrument and learn the repertoire and learn the techniques and learn what's possible. But, our syllabus, like that a lot of people in the past thought was like the only way to learn, is actually has only one goal in mind, which is the traditional thing at that point in time,
Right.
right? I think it's important for all of us to rethink that. The danger, of course, is like some people are like, well, okay, well, I learned something for like 3 months. I'm ready to
Yeah.
collaborate and
Yeah.
do stuff.
That and
And
that
he's like,
is not unheard of these days.
yeah, right,
People's level of focus, or
right,
um, the like you said, the number of things you can be distracted by
right.
um, is a lot. So it probably does take a great deal of effort for you to,
Yeah.
get people to learn a certain, sort of amount to be able to do something with their knowledge as well.
Yeah. And I tend to take like you know, it's not like a very top-down approach like with my students. It's like I try to model whatever it is I'm trying to preach, right? Practice what you preach. So if students want to collaborate, like I have to be an example for how you might want to collaborate. I'm not saying this is the only way to do it. I'm doing it the way that makes sense for me based on my abilities, my interests, my circumstances. Um, so if that's of interest to you, if that inspires some people, great. If my art is not inspiring you, then you have to find like another path or whatever. So I'm not like too worried about. I feel like in any generation, like you're going to find there's always people who want to like get really good at something and want to do something really well and focus on quality. There may be a lot of people who don't. That's fine. That's up to them. Social media and stuff makes it very easy to be distracted, to appear to know something, appear to do something of interest just based on likes. But there's always people who are like, okay, actually, what else is possible? And if you have someone who's setting a standard that's way beyond that you're generally seeing, like it's always going to be an inspiration. And Carnatic music and jazz and pop and every part of the Nautium, like there are practitioners who are pushing the envelope and setting new standards, so that anyone who gets into the art forms like realizes there's more that can be done. It's up to you whether you want to do it or not.
Well, that sort of is a great transition to our final question for you, which is, how do you see technology shaping the future of Indian classical music, and what are your views on that?
Yeah, I mean it's a huge topic. So I did my doctorate in musicology and ethnomusicology, and my dissertation was actually on virtual music lessons, like the whole Skype training phenomenon in the context of Indian percussion. So I have like 300 pages of things to say about this. But and at the
Give us
time,
like 3 minutes of
yeah,
it.
yeah. I mean, it's, I think it's, again, it's all like, it's a means to an end. A lot of people ask me, like, is like the online experience like better or worse than the in-person? I said it's like apples and oranges. Actually, they're different experiences, right? Like what we're doing right now is a different experience from being in the same room together around a table. It's just a different experience. It's not to say it's better or worse. Like here we are cross country doing this, like this is great, but it's not, there's a variety of things that are different about this experience than in person, right? So, and at the end of the day, like the success of any like learning, medium, it depends on the teacher and the student and like the family support system, right? So, that's true whether it's in person or online or with video, without video. Like I was able to learn without video because I had the other things in place. I had an incredible teacher, a supportive family. I was interested and also a kid, so I didn't even know what I was doing. I was just kind of, like practicing and doing stuff on a weekly basis. But so it worked out. But so you need all of these things to kind of come together. But one thing I'm going to say is like when it comes to learning an instrument or something like that, again, there's basically no shortcuts. Like you have to practice, you have to do your thing to develop some control over the instrument. whatever that instrument is, whatever that medium of expression is, like you have to put in the time to do it. And technology, it can help with that, but there's also something to be said about like just you have to do it, right? Like, I mean, again, I think in the arts, we sometimes like there's this question about technology and how do we deal with it, but I often like think I also use the analogy of sports, right, where it's like, yeah, like there's a lot of technology in sports, but how are most athletes training? It's kind of the way people have been training for a long time. Okay, maybe you have some new metrics, some new data, some new tools that you can use, but the sport is the sport, and like you have to still practice these things over and over and over. The muscle memory, like there's no
I
shortcut
guess
to it.
human beings aren't evolving as fast as technology is.
Course.
So,
Technology is telling us maybe new things about what we're doing, but we still have to do it, and like that takes dedication, motivation, energy. There's a of course in there's a lot that's not in your hands as well, literally and figuratively. So there's a lot of stars have to align, to meet the right people and to have the energy to do all the things that you have to do. But
well,
it's also a good thing. I'm actually going to say, like, if it's like, is YouTube like a good thing or a bad thing? Like having access to information is always a good thing. Now, whether the information is accurate or not, like there's challenges that we have to figure out. But that's where the teacher, the guru, is really critical, right? Like probably more than ever before. Like I always tell my students, I'm like, I mean, go ahead and like search for drums on YouTube, but like just be careful. Like the first thing you see might be some like random clip that went viral like 5 minutes ago, some kid practicing in their room. It's like, is that what you really want to learn from? Like maybe not, right? Like, so you have to have a teacher who can help filter through the material and
seems like you need guidance even more if you're
even
going
more.
to use those technological
Yeah,
tools.
yeah. I mean, I have a lot of students who come to me saying I watched like an entire YouTube series, and some of them have learned actually a lot of really good stuff, but they don't even know what they've learned and like what the context is. Like they can do a great bunch of stuff. It's like, but they actually don't have any idea of like the context for it. So that like that guide, that guru, that teacher, I think is even more important today because there's just like so much information, unfiltered, information accessible to us now.
That's a fantastic point. Any lasting, sort of last pieces of advice that you'd like to give to emerging artists in your genre or others, but anything that you'd like to uh,
Yeah.
give
I,
away?
I mean, again, like I, I thank you guys for inviting me and for even sharing my ideas. Like again, everyone has a unique experience, so I don't like to ever like be like you have to do these three things. There's no roadmap here. We all have a different experience. There's no roadmap for life. Like you can't do these 10 things and like have a perfect life. Like you have to figure it out yourself. You have to navigate it in your own ways. Um, I think uh I'm optimistic that there are always like people in different parts of the world, and thanks to technology, actually, we're seeing more and more talent like in different parts of the world that we may not have even seen, before. People in rural areas who happen to have a phone, who happen to record something, and like we're like, wow, okay, there really is talent everywhere. So, um, you can there's always people who are going to really want to learn and do things genuinely, collaborate with people genuinely, not just to like create something cool and to market it, but actually to form like human, relations, and to actually create like a lasting human bond with people. And I think that kind of thing really resonates, with audiences of all kinds. So and I think that like you're saying, the technology makes some of these things, more possible. Uh, but the flip side again is like I think students like nowadays who have like a phone from whatever, from elementary school onwards, like you have to be really really careful about like being how to stay focused. A lot of like what I teach and what I have to even teach myself or remind myself is how to stay focused. How do you not get distracted every 5 minutes with whatever your phone or with your device, and like so that staying focused, I think the arts, and learning, an art form is a great way to build that like focus and discipline. Um, uh, and of course, this cultural knowledge and tradition and intergenerational, respect and humility. Like I think it's more important than ever to have that kind of discipline in your life. Otherwise, it's actually it's almost impossible to develop that kind of focus and discipline without some kind of like uh, you know, um, a passion or some kind of like activity that channels your energy that way. So
Absolutely. No, that these are all, I mean, I feel like there are so many things here that are important for emerging artists to know and learn. But also even, I think I took away a lot from this discussion that, when you sit down and think about it are very true. So thank you so much for your time. And we will be asking more of your knowledge to be passed down and shared with this next generation of artists that comes up. But it's a real treat to be able to have you speak openly about your own journey and also your views on what makes a good artist and what made you a good artist. So.
sure. Yeah, thanks a lot, Bonnie. And again, thank you for, building this community, in our, in the Indian arts space in the diaspora, especially. There's a lot of, great talent, a lot of audiences, a lot of students, but we still need more and more sort of spaces to come together and to tie together our activities and to kind of bring our like community capacity, together. So I think, what you're doing and what you're trying to build through this online space and in person as well is really, really important as we kind of develop this ecosystem for our generation and beyond.
Thank you. Thank you, Rohan.